I see I've got a controller up here. Am I supposed to change these, or are they doing it from... Okay, so I can... Just leave it? Okay, good morning, everyone. This morning we are going to launch into a new series entitled Stories You Thought You Knew. Between now and summer, we're going to take you on a journey through many of the great stories of the faith, and we're going to mess with everything you thought you knew about them. There's tremendous fear, I think, in the hearts of most Christians that some rationalistic academic like myself would come along and declare that the stories in the Bible are myth. Relax, we're not going to do that. Our teaching team here at Lakewood holds to the belief that the Bible is true in all that it affirms. The question we need to answer is just exactly what is the Bible affirming? You see, in our great fear of being asked to perceive the biblical stories as a myth, we've actually embraced the very activity we're trying to avoid. We mythologize many of the stories in Scripture. For example, 3 wise men came to visit Jesus Christ in the manger. No, they didn't. First, there weren't 3 of them. There were 3 gifts. But the Bible doesn't say how many wise men there were. And second, they never visited Jesus in the manger. They didn't arrive in Bethlehem until Jesus was approaching his 2nd birthday. But we've mythologized that. Much of what we think happened in Scripture, much of what we think we know about Scripture, actually never happened. Or it didn't happen the way we think it did. But due to several factors, church tradition, the mythology of the Middle Ages, Sunday school oversimplification, our understanding of the great stories of the Bible is often distorted. And that's what we're going to have fun with in this series. We're going to straighten out a few crooked paths. We're beginning this morning with one of the big ones. Where do we have it up here? Noah's Ark. Whoa. In Genesis chapters 6 to 9. Other than the creation story, there's probably been no other biblical narrative that's been as attacked as much as the story of Noah. And that's because it has its problems. If you're a total rationalist, my advice to you is don't go near the story of Noah. Because obviously there's something supernatural going on in this tale. There's a miracle happening here on many levels. Now, I'm not going to go through this story in detail because everybody knows it. Everybody in the church, everybody outside there, they know the story of Noah's Ark. But what people believe about the story of Noah's Ark can be divided into 4 schools of thought. Now, my slide for this one failed, so we don't have one, but I'll tell you. The first belief is that the story is just a myth. It's total myth. Most people outside of the Judeo-Christian community hold to this position, some even within it. The problem with this position is it really attacks the inerrancy of Scripture. Much of what is stated in the Bible has been discredited this same way in the past, only to be later discovered as true. You know, archaeologists once believed that the Hittite nation was a fabrication of biblical authors. Then in 1834, a guy by the name of Charles Técher found proof of their empire. Solomon's city of Megiddo was once believed to be a fairy tale. Then in 1903, Gottlieb Schumacher excavated its remains. To this day, the Bible remains the single most valuable textbook for ancient Near East archaeology. Its contents are true. Now, a second approach, one that's sadly become more popular among modern scholars, is that the story of Noah is an intentional allegory. It's not literal. It merely represents salvation. Now, this is where it gets a bit confusing because there are some allegories in the Bible. Jesus told the story of the prodigal son as an allegory of God's unconditional love. Paul talked about the sons of Sarah and Hagar in the Old Testament in allegorical terms. But the problem with viewing the story of Noah as an allegory is that the genre of allegory was invented by the Greeks. Okay, it didn't exist when Moses wrote Genesis. It's really hard to have an allegory when there's no such thing as an allegory, okay? The third approach to the story of Noah is the one most conservative evangelical Christians hold to. And that the story aligns with the traditional interpretation, that you just take it at face value. But this view is actually not without its problems. The first being that there is absolutely no geological evidence for a global flood. That's a big one. I'm not saying there wasn't a flood, I'm just saying that there's no evidence. Another problem is that geologists have determined already that if all the water on Earth, all the subterranean water that's below the Earth's surface, all the water in the atmosphere, all the water in the oceans, all the water in the lakes, if it were all relocated to the surface of the planet, it would raise the ocean level about 230 feet. That's not enough to submerge the whole planet. And then there's some of the practical issues in this story. How did two of every animal from North and South America make their way to West Africa? What about the animals from Australia and Antarctica? You know, I'm not saying that the traditional interpretation of the story is wrong. I'm just saying that the perspective of scientific understanding, as we look at the story of Noah, there are problems. But there's a fourth approach that has really caught my interest in recent years in my studies, and that's that the idea that the story is literal. It really happened. But our understanding of it has been strongly interpreted by earlier misunderstandings, or strongly influenced by earlier misinterpretations would be a better way of saying it. It's an interesting idea. That we're so afraid of liberal theologians mythologizing the story of Noah that we may not be aware that we're guilty of doing the same thing. Let me try to explain that. We need to begin with Moses. Moses recorded this story, okay? It actually occurred several millennia before his time. It was communicated to him by God, but obviously in terminology that Moses could understand. That's something we call cultural condescension. I can't go to a primitive tribe in the Amazon basin and say, listen, all you need to do is download a good AI app on your smartphone. It's going to be gibberish to them. I would have to say there's a little box that can think like a human, push the right buttons, and it will do that. We need to understand that Moses lived in the early Bronze Age. This is an artist's rendition of a state-of-the-art bronze workshop from the time of Moses. This is not highly advanced compared to our modern culture. Even if Moses was the Leonardo da Vinci of his day, the concepts of building a vessel like the ark, understanding that, differential equations, bending moment, torque, shear stress, hull deflection, all would have meant nothing to him. God had to condescend to explain this story to Moses. But you know what else would have meant nothing to Moses? The concept of the earth. The earth as a planet wasn't even theorized until the Greeks got hold of the idea in 200 BC and started playing with it. The Hebrew word that's translated in our Bibles as earth is eretz. It means land. Biblical scholars are now exploring the idea that we may have reverse translated this word. Okay, let me explain what that means. Reverse translation is when you start with a word that once had a meaning, such as eretz. In Moses' time, eretz was everything you could see added to everything you knew about. What lay beyond that was a mystery. Moses knew nothing of Europe and East Asia. He knew nothing of North and South America. But the word eretz began to evolve over the years. Eretz gradually morphed into the Old English word eorth, which became our modern word earth. But just it wasn't just the pronunciation that changed, the meaning of the word changed as well. As knowledge increased over the ages, the word came to be understood as the planet Earth. When we say Earth, we go, I mean, there's another sense, the dirt. But when somebody says something happened on Earth, we go planet. And our brains immediately go there. The problem occurs when the ancient word eretz is translated by its modern meaning. That's reverse translation. And the modern meaning was arrived at by a combination of later knowledge and the understanding of Jewish rabbinical scholars following the Persian exile, after the exile. And those guys were notorious. I've read their literature. They're notoriously all over the map. But it's really an interesting theory. Now, if you had trouble kind of following that line of thought, what you really need to know is what we think. We think that the word eretz means earth. It doesn't. It means land. Okay? Try reading Genesis 6, 7, and 8 and replace the word earth with the word land. It's a real eye-opener. Now, that's Moses. Let me take a look at Noah himself. Some of the references in the Genesis story, such as the planting of a vineyard, lead us to believe that 6,500 to 5,500 BC might be a good date for Noah. We base that on something we call reverse genetic phenotyping of the Venus vinifera plant. What does that mean? It's a common wine grape. He made wine. Planted a vineyard and he made wine. Paleoanthropologists call this era in which the wine grape was developed the mid-Holocene. It was still in the Stone Age. Let me show you a rendition of a man 3,000 years after Noah's time. Okay, it's up here. This is let's see, the Iceman. His body was found on the border of Austria and Italy in 1991. He had in his possession the oldest bronze tool ever discovered in Europe. I was actually going to bring you a museum replica of that, and it's still sitting on my table at home. Oh, well. But the point is, Noah built the ark using flint tools, okay? His concept of the earth was what he could see to the horizon. Like Moses, he knew nothing of the planet as a whole. Okay, that's kind of a starting point. Just tuck that away in your mind, and let's shift gears a bit and examine the science of the Bible story, okay? I'm going to put a picture up here. Can we get that? Yeah, okay. I was on the crew of this boat back in 1973. It's a riverboat. Took tourists up and down the Red River in Winnipeg. Red River is not very deep, okay? And the bottom changes all the time. So whenever the crew noticed the screws churning up mud behind this behemoth, one of my jobs was to go out on the rail on the bow there and act as lead man. I would take a rope that was marked off in fathoms, and you know, the measurements were all in these little ribbons tied to it. A fathom is 6 feet, by the way. But it had a lead weight at the end. That's why you're called a leadman. And I would toss it in the water, and as we cruised by, I would call out the depth to the pilot house over my shoulder. The magic number was Mark 1, which is 6 feet of water. But you know, whenever we had to map the channel, we always did a little diversion to the inside corners where the water was deeper so we could yell, you guessed it, Mark Twain. There would always be a little murmur among the passengers. Oh, you said Mark Twain. And I'd think, okay, there's your thrill for the day. You need to get out of the house more. But the reason that Mark 1 was the magic number is that this boat, even though it was 500 tons dead weight, plus 300 passengers, it only had a draft of 4.2 feet. 6 feet was lots of water. Now, Archimedes' principle says that the weight of a vessel floating on water is equal to the weight of the water it displaces. Okay? The amount of water it pushes aside sitting in the water. Genesis chapter 7, verse 20, we read these words. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 6.9 meters, if you convert it to metric. How did Noah know that? He knew it because the ark drew 6.9 meters of water, and he wasn't hitting anything. So, if we take the dimensions of his vessel, stated in Genesis chapter 6, which is about 140 meters long, 24 meters wide, and we have to realize, of course, that this wasn't a ship. This was a barge. It's a non-powered floating box on the water. But if we take those two dimensions and we multiply them by the draft, we get the displacement of the ark. And when we apply Archimedes' principle and multiply that number by the weight of a cubic meter of water, we get the weight of the ark. Fully loaded, ark, animals, food, fresh water, people, cutlery, extra socks, etc. It weighed a total of 1,910,529.5 kilograms, give or take a few grams. Now, why the heck does this matter? Okay, because in 2014, a group of graduate physics students from Leicester University in England calculated the estimated weight of a cypress wood ark as described in the Bible. They added the weight of the animals that would need to be saved. Not all animals needed, obviously sea mammals, fish, they don't need to be saved from a flood. And the weight of all the feed and the fresh water that would be needed to keep them alive for 150 days. Then they forwarded their calculations to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. Here's a quote that was printed in the Smithsonian magazine. You don't think of the Bible necessarily as a scientifically accurate source of information. So we were quite surprised when we discovered it would work. We're not proving that it's true, but the concept would definitely work. But the weight of the ark is not the only scientific plausibility when it comes to the Genesis account. There's a simple ratio that marine engineers need to adhere to when constructing vessels. It's the length to beam ratio. How many times the width of a vessel will fit into the length? For smaller vessels, that number can be quite low. 1 to 2.5, 1 to 3 is really common. Larger vessels allow for higher ratios. Some modern seagoing vessels are as much as 1 to 9. But that's only because of computerized stabilizers and bow thrusters and things like that. Barges are a different story. They don't have engines. In order to prevent something called wave-induced pitch and roll, there's a window that marine engineers need to keep in mind. American Society of Naval Engineers state that as between 1 to 4.5 for shorter vessels and 1 to 5.8 for larger ones. This is for barges. Noah's Ark was 1 to 5.8. Now we have to remember Noah had no education in naval architecture. Boat building in his day was limited to wicker baskets with skin stretched over them. The scientific disciplines of calculus, mechanics, structural analysis would not arise for thousands of years. There was no shipbuilding tradition behind him, no experienced craftsman to offer advice, yet with God's input, he nailed his length to beam ratio precisely to the fraction. A ship even approaching this size wouldn't be built until Ptolemy Philopator built one in 220 BC, 5,000 years after Noah. But there's more. Naval architects are also aware of something called the skin friction coefficient. This applies to all kinds of things. They use it for air flowing over, laminar flow over window or wings and all kinds of things. But here's the deal. If the hull of a vessel is overly textured, broadside waves will counter too much resistance on that hull, and there will be no roll damping, as the engineers say. Basically, if the hull of a vessel is not slippery enough, the waves will flip it over. Now, let me read you Genesis 6:14. This is part of God's instructions to Noah. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch, inside and out. This isn't tree pitch. like so many commentaries will say. I have tree pitch all over the place. I use it to start fires. It's water soluble. This is bitumen pitch, naturally occurring surface tar petroleum, which is very slippery. Noah even got his skin friction coefficient right. But the interesting thing is you can't just find bitumen pitch everywhere. You can't go down the street and find a pile lying at the end of the road. Surface deposits are only found in certain locations on this planet. The western U.S., the La Brea tar pits. Venezuela has some. Trinidad and Tobago has a really big one. And the other really big deposit, called the Bina Gadi Asphalt Lake, is located beside the Black Sea in West Asia. Now, that's a really interesting location because in late 1997, oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in Palisades, New York, they published evidence from sediment cores that they drilled at the bottom of the Black Sea. The Black Sea borders Turkey, right beside the Ararat Mountains, where the Genesis account says the ark came to rest. The core showed that around 6,000 to 5,500 BC, water from a rising Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural barrier at the Bosporus Straits and catastrophically raised water levels in the Black Sea by about 150 meters. Scientists said it would have been like throwing a bucket of water onto a floor and just observing it. They said there's a delay as the water kind of sloshes back and begins to spread out and find its own level. Only with the Black Sea inundation event, it would have taken, on average, 150 days for that dissipation to occur. Biblical account says that Noah was in the ark for 150 days before the waters receded and he came to rest on land. In addition, the Ryan Pittman study estimated that an area of about 150,000 kilometers was flooded. Certainly enough for an ancient observer to say that the waters covered all the land, all the arêtes. It's equivalent to an area about the same as from Prince George to Hinton and then south to Kamloops. It's a big area. In July of 1998, Robert Ballard, I don't know if you know the name, he's the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic wreck in the 80s, launched an expedition to the Black Sea in an attempt to verify this story. In 100 meters of water, Ballard discovered man-made structures and an ancient shoreline. This is a bit grainy, but it's one of Ballard's underwater photographers from the bottom of the Black Sea. The anaerobic conditions have perfectly preserved the wooden structures. But there's even more evidence that supports the Genesis flood account. Whether this was a localized flood, as the evidence infers, or a global flood, in keeping with the conventional theology, following the event, it would make sense that generations of people would retain a residual memory of this catastrophe and pass it on in written and oral traditions. Anthropologists have recorded flood myths and narratives in 264 cultures. Some of the stories from nations closer to the Black Sea are very old, and they contain remarkable similarities to the Genesis account. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Akkadian tells of the building of an ark into which was placed the seed of all living things. The ark then endured a great flood brought on by angry gods. When the rains subsided, the people on the ark sent out birds to find dry land, after which the ark came to rest on a mountain. The story was written over 500 years before Moses wrote the book of Genesis. Now, that doesn't mean that Genesis copied that account. Please understand, It doesn't predate the story of Moses. Moses wrote about events that occurred long before his time, but the logical conclusion is this is the same story. But here's the point of all of this. The story of the flood is not a myth. There's strong scientific and cultural evidence that it happened if you know where to look. And we need to understand that it is legitimate to subject biblical stories to limited scientific scrutiny. God is the author of science. Science is the academic discipline by which we understand God's creation. But we also need to understand that, Dave talked about this morning, the Bible's not a technical manual. It's not designed to tell us everything about every subject. The story of Noah was not recorded as a geotechnical manual of a global flood event. Yet so many Christians of today demand that of it. In the same way we demand the creation account to present us with a calculable timeline, it was not designed to do that. The story of Noah and his ark has been passed down to us so we can be reminded of God's intolerance of sin, his salvation of the righteous, but also to show us that a reboot of civilization is not the answer to the problem. You ever notice that theme, that thread running through the Bible? God reboots civilization, humanity keeps on sinning. He breaks up the nations into 1,000 languages, we keep on sinning. He sends patriarchs to guide us, we keep on sinning. He sends judges to do the same. We keep on sinning. He sends kings, same thing. He sends prophets. People won't listen to them. They keep on sinning. He sends nations to take sinners captive and lead them into exile. But they keep on sinning. Finally, God says, okay, are we done? Can you think of anything we haven't covered? We need to understand that these thousands of years of failure were not for God's benefit. He wasn't wearing himself out trying different solutions. He knew before he started that they weren't going to work. We're the ones who needed to know. The ark wasn't about God, it was about Noah. And if you embrace the wisdom at the heart of the story, it's about us. It wasn't about God needing to rescue 2 of every animal on earth. God can make new animals out of the dust. The story of Noah points to the cross. The entire Bible points to the cross. The Bible is a record of complete, utter, abject failure, so much so that God finally even stopped talking to people. For 400 years, he said nothing. It was his great inhale before, in the middle of the Jordan River in Roman-occupied Israel, he uttered these words, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." If the story of the Old Testament is one of repeated failures that point us to the cross, the story of the New Testament is one in which God says, okay, now it's my turn. And with absolutely no struggle on our part, no earning, no performance, no being good enough, no meeting the expectations of anyone, God stepped in and took the penalty of sin upon himself. You think Noah's Ark is a miracle? Just look at the cross. That's a miracle. And he didn't even stop at complete and absolute forgiveness. He went on to say, and you know that sin business that you guys have been fighting with? I got that covered as well. I'm going to share my spirit with you so that every morning you wake up, you're going to be a bit more like me than when you went to bed. And to qualify for this incredible grace, all we need to do is believe. It's amazing. I'm going to wrap this up, but here's how I'm going to close. We always talk about the little blue Get Connected card in the seat back pockets, but there's a couple of other cards in there as well. One of them is green. It's a really important card, okay? In fact, it can be life-changing. If you haven't already made a decision to follow Christ in your life, I want to invite you to take that out, put your name on it, and check off the box. I have decided to follow Jesus. Very simple. The moment you do that, the adventure begins. You can ask anybody who's already done that. That's just the starting line. Now, as pastors, we'd like to know about that decision. So we're asking you, if you do that, either drop it in the offering basket or give it to one of the hospitality team members. But we're not the important players in this decision if you make it. You see, I have it on very good authority that God can read. And he can look over your shoulder as well. Trust me, I have experience with that. So let's not complicate things, you know. It's just a simple way of saying yes to God. You know, Jesus never said, you need to pray a magic prayer to get into heaven. You know what all Jesus ever did? Follow me. That's what he said. Check that box if you want to follow Jesus. Well, we're gonna transition into a time of response now. This is a time when you can maybe process some of what you heard today. You can sit and talk to God. You can let our worship team lead you in song. If you'd like someone to pray with you, you make your way over to the prayer room here. At any time after we celebrate the Lord's Supper together, our prayer team members are in there waiting for you. But first, we're going to remember the sacrifice of Jesus Christ by joining together as a church community and partaking of these symbols that he left us. The bread symbolizing his body broken for us, the cup symbolizing his lifeblood shed as a payment for the debt of our sins. Our communion servers are going to come up and stand at the front here. During the first song, I want to invite you to come up, receive the elements, return to your seat, and partake whenever you feel ready. Everyone's invited. Kids, if there's any kids still in here, guests. You know, our King doesn't turn people away. Once everyone has shared in the communion, members of our hospitality team will come around and receive the morning offering. You can also give at the kiosk in the foyer. For those of you joining us online, I think you click on the donate button on the web page. But let's worship God together.